Welcome back to another episode of Glasp Talk. And today we are thrilled to have David Elikwu, the founder of The Knowledge, where he helps over 30,000 people enhance their productivity, creativity, and decision making. And also, he is a co-founder and Chief Strategy Officer at Zendaya, and an African-focused luxury e-commerce platform. And David's journey spans from marketing campaigns for giants like Amazon to billion-dollar deals in corporate law. And he's a prolific learner and passionate writer, and sharing his insights through his newsletter, podcast, and course. And with a background in consulting, product strategy, and operations, David's diverse experience make him a powerhouse of knowledge and inspiration. And in 2019, he was recognized as a Yahoo Finance Involved Top 50 Future Leader. And join us, we dig into his fascinating career and valuable insights. So thank you for joining, David.
Thank you for having me, and such a great introduction as well.
Yeah. So, first of all, I introduced you briefly, but could you introduce yourself to people who don't know you yet?
Yeah, sure. So, I think you actually did a fantastic job with the introduction, really. If there's any specific questions about my career background, I'm happy to answer. But in terms of right now, like you say, I write The Knowledge. I also teach a course on decision making called Decision Hacker. So part of that is the online course, which is open to everyone. And then simultaneously, I also occasionally go and work with corporates and with startups and workshop on decision making and things with them. I facilitate workshops and that kind of stuff. So
Cool. Thank you. And you are writing, every day. I know you started writing at 5, but could you, share why did you start writing and why you love writing?
Yeah, sure. I think part of it has just been organic in terms of it might have started probably from reading. So I've always enjoyed reading. I think I remember when I came to the UK from Nigeria, and I remember starting to go to school here, and within my first week or so, I saw the school library. And it's funny because now I realize that my school was actually really tiny compared to a lot of other people's schools. So I'm sure a lot of other people had much bigger libraries in their schools. But to me, the library that we had was massive, and it was really incredible. And so from there, I just started reading loads of different books. I read like fiction. I don't think there was really any nonfiction, but I'd read like some fantasy books. I first got into Harry Potter. I read the Chronicles of Narnia, The Lion, the Witch of the Wardrobe, a lot of those things. And so I think a lot of my writing journey started then. And then in a corporate context, I think, again, it's just a function of sometimes you are just required to write, and there's things that you need to write. And then as you do more of that, you start to improve and you get better at being able to present ideas clearly. And then I realized that I think, oh, actually, this seems to be a unique skill. This seems to be something that I am actually a lot better at than maybe some other people. And I think I definitely got the sense of that when I was working in corporate law. I was in at a really big law firm for about 4.5 to 5 years. And during that time, very often what you get is you might see that sometimes the partners of law firms will write articles in industry magazines and in newspapers and in a lot of other places. But what people might not know is that actually behind the scenes, there's usually like junior associates that do a lot of the early drafting. The partner will still come and like polish things up and then add their touches, but usually the starting point is getting some associates to draft stuff, to do the research, to pull things together. And I started doing some of that for some different partners at the firm that I was at, and people actually seemed to love my stuff. So much so that even when I would move to different teams, the people that I used to work with would still come and find me in the building and ask me to write more articles for them. And so I think it really just started from there, which is like, oh, people are realizing that, hey, this is something that I'm really good at, and they specifically want me to write stuff, even if their name's going to be on it. And then actually I got a few opportunities where some partners would actually put my name alongside theirs. And so I think I had an article that was in the Africa Global Finance Review. I'd written something, for a partner or with the partner, but they also put my name on it. And that's something that doesn't usually happen. And so that was a really good opportunity. And I think from there, then I just kind of built more momentum. And then I think leading from there to then writing The Knowledge, again, I think it was a little bit organic. I started it in 2020, and the very first issue, you can go back and look at some of them. You will see that the first 10 are completely random. Each one is almost on a completely different topic, and it was very much the starting point of, hey, I'm just trying to share the things that I'm learning. I'm very much interested in learning. I like reading. I like gathering information from different places. And I wanted somewhere that I could share that with friends and people around me. And then the audience of that just grew. And I think there was probably a few inflection points where I had to figure out, okay, this thing is growing. What is it actually going to be, or what should it be? And so the identity of the knowledge kind of grew as the platform grew.
I see. Could you share that reflection point? You mentioned like 2 to 3, like a few reflection point. Some point of, did you like a specific topic went viral or specific post went viral, and could you share a bit about that?
Yeah, that's a good question, actually. I'm trying to think now if there were specific posts. Um, Early on, I think there were a few. I'm not sure if it specifically that they went viral, but the audience did seem to grow. And then there were a few people that I actually respected, kind of beyond the people I didn't necessarily know before. I'm not sure if you know of Thomas Frank, who is like a productivity YouTuber. So he had read something that I wrote and shared it with his audience. And then also Paul Jarvis, if you've heard of him, he wrote a great book called, I'm trying to remember the name. I think it's like One Person Business or something like that. He's written a great book, but also he's been a startup founder as well. And he wrote a newsletter that I read at the time. And he also shared something that I'd written with his audience. And so suddenly, I think with each of those, overnight, suddenly you get like a few hundred extra subscribers. And then it's like, oh, okay, I need to figure out, what I'm going to be writing about. And then kind of the identity of the platform changed slightly from being extremely personal and just being about all of my personal interests to being a tiny bit more corporate. But I think hopefully we've come full circle a bit where, okay, fine, we went a bit more corporate and now I've kind of brought it back to being slightly more personal, where I'm still sharing things that are personally interesting to me and not just being like a faceless corporation type of thing.
I see. And you mentioned, you have a website and I think Substack you're using. And why, did you try other platforms like writing platform? There are like a Medium and then so on, other platforms. Have you tried other platforms or did you? Oh, yeah, I'm curious the combination and why did you
Yeah, that's
choose?
a great question because I'm no longer on Substack. I left Substack a few years ago, actually, but I did start on Substack. I had thought about a few different platforms at the time, but what was very unique about Substack, specifically when I started, this is right at the beginning of 2020, and that is actually quite early. I think this is before most people were on Substack, at least as far as I know. I think most people that have Substacks now made them after that time, because I think I probably started the account, or I'd signed up in 2019, but I hadn't started sending anything until 2020. And so there was still a little bit of discovery of trying to find the best platform. Substack was just really good because they made the writing part easy. You didn't have to design a website, you didn't have to do anything else. You could just write, and that's all I needed to do. And so it was a really good starting point for that. But then as we grew, and maybe this is another one of those inflection points, I think we got to a point where at the time, again, because this is quite early in Substack's journey, you couldn't have your own domain. And so obviously, as we're starting to grow, then I'm realizing, oh, I'm publishing all this stuff, but I have no ownership of it, actually. It's a Substack branded website. There's nothing that I own here. There's no SEO because it all actually goes to Substack and it just happens to have my name on it. So it was actually in 2021, I think probably November 2021, that I decided, okay, I want to have my own website that has my own domain that I have some control over and I can get some SEO and that kind of stuff. And so we moved from Substack to Ghost. And there was a bit of a weird transition period that has now, I think, finally ended, where moving from Ghost, initially, I think we did everything through Ghost. So we had the website that was hosted on Ghost as the CMS, but then also I sent the emails through Ghost. But Substack used to be free, and Ghost, you have to pay. And again, we had another inflection point when we finally hit 1,000 subscribers. And I think for a few months, we had kept hitting 1,000 subscribers and I kept unsubscribing people because once you hit 1,000, you have to start paying even more. And I didn't want to start paying more. So I would just be unsubscribing people manually every few days or every few weeks. And then eventually I just accepted it and I said, okay, we need to grow. So I, paid the extra amount and then we grew beyond 1,000. And I think at that time, I also I'd signed up for ConvertKit. And so I was starting to send some of the emails with ConvertKit, but I was still hosting the website on Ghost. And So I think as we grew, I think even going from like 1,000 subscribers to 2,000 subscribers, again, that's another point where you have to start paying more. But because I'm split across two platforms, you have to start paying more on two platforms. And so again, I was like, wow, that's going to be expensive. And so I eventually moved from hosting on Ghost to being self-hosted. So I actually still pay a platform to host it, but it's at least a lot cheaper than hosting it directly with Ghost. And then everything else is on ConvertKit. And I would say, funny enough, I feel like I'm going back to your question about inflection points again as I think about it, because then there was another inflection point, probably within the last year or two, where we then started growing extremely quickly, probably from the beginning of last year, where we went from about 2,500 subscribers to, I want to say, about 20,000 or 25,000 quite quickly, just within 6 or 7 months. And each month it kind of doubled. So we went from like, 2,300, something like that, to like 4,000, then 8,000. And as we went through each point, obviously the amount you pay goes up as well. And so my cost grew massively. And I think we grew faster than I had anticipated. So then that was also another inflection point where I had to think about, okay, I wasn't really prepared for this to become a business, but it kind of has to be, because now all the costs have gone up quite dramatically because we have a really big audience now. So now I need to figure out, okay, what's a business model that is going to allow me to keep running this sustainably? Maybe we need to get some ads. Maybe we need to work with some partners. And so that's when I kind of had to build a business around the platform.
I see. Interesting. And when we just growing so rapidly, so how many newsletters were you publishing? So monthly or weekly?
Yeah, so I
Do you
think at that
remember?
point,
Yeah.
this is, I think, when I decided to make the change to, I was now running 3 newsletters, all under the knowledge. So I had one weekly, there's the main one called Revelations, and then I had one fortnightly on Tuesdays called Brainwave, and then one fortnightly on Saturdays called Wayfinder. So Revelations was mostly about creativity and productivity. Brainwave was about like business, technology, philosophy, psychology, that kind of stuff. And then the Saturday one was about decision making. That's Wayfinder. So I had sat down. I think also I had quit my job somewhere around this time. And so it was all quite intentional. I wanted to take this seriously and actually try to grow it. And I think in the December, so this is probably maybe December 2022, I had taken some off when I wrote 41 newsletters that month. So to prepare for, from January. And
Yeah.
so the first of those newsletters, I think actually I sent on New Year's Eve, so the 24th of December. And then starting from January, we had like all new content, all new newsletters, loads of other new stuff. And so I think that's when we started to see the serious growth, because I went back and I rewrote a lot of previous stuff and I wrote a bunch of new stuff, and I, intentionally kind of tried to prepare for that growth. But we still grew more than I would have expected anyway.
Oh yeah, really good thing. Yeah. And I like the name of the newsletter, The Knowledge. So yeah, I read a short description, but so why did you name it? So could you tell our audience?
Yeah, sure. So, funny enough, I realized a little while after starting it that there's also someone else, what's his name? Shane Parrish, that has a blog called Farnham Street and a podcast called The Knowledge Project. And so sometimes people think, oh, is that where I got the inspiration from? It had nothing to do with that. I didn't even know that existed. But the inspiration came from, I'm a Londoner, I live in London, and there is a famous, at least if you're here, a famous test that's taken by taxi drivers. So we call them cabbies, and taxi drivers in London have to take a test that's called the knowledge. It's set up in some books. They're called blue books. And so they study these tests, and basically they have to memorize, I think, about 22,000 roads and streets in London. And so that's their preparation for this test. So that's called the knowledge. And I think the inspiration was that I wanted this newsletter to be about helping people to navigate the world and navigate life. And so it was about trying to build like a digital map in a way that helps people navigate the world.
I see. Interesting. Yeah, I know the test, so taxi exam, and so yeah, it was shown in like Japanese TV or English TV. I forgot, but so I remember it. And so this is out of the topic, but so does the test still exist in London? So because so people
Yes,
can
yeah.
see the smartphone side. So, but is it needed? Just
That's
curious.
the thing. Yeah. So I
Yeah.
think it does still exist, but it is a lot more difficult, especially now that people use Uber and stuff. But if you get into a black cab in London, they should typically, especially if you get into a traditional black cab, they might not use a GPS at all because they should have memorized most of the roads in London.
Wow.
Yeah. At least in like central London.
Yeah, but
if they're going further out, then they'll probably use a GPS.
I see. That's so interesting. Yeah. Maybe they are protecting taxi drivers or like, it's a tradition. But yeah, I don't know, but it's interesting that system still exists.
And
yeah, I love it. And it's great if you get into a cab. It's fun just knowing you can tell them the address and they kind of know where to go and where it
so
is.
The shortest way. So something. Yeah, I see. And so you're writing a lot of articles on the knowledge. So where do your ideas comes from? So to write
that's a
about.
really
So
good
you're like
question. Yeah, so I'd say it's a mix. A lot of it comes from reading. Kind of what I alluded to before. I think probably 70% of it comes, oh, actually, no, more or less. It could be 50%, 50 to 70% comes from reading. And what that means is a lot of it might be reading other people's blogs. It could be reading books. It could be reading things people say on Twitter. But the reason I would say it's not 100% is I think the other 50 to 30% comes from, for me, it's actually just walking. So I just walk around. But for you or for someone else, it could be, something else. But I think that it requires this time for intentional thought. And I actually need to spend some time thinking about the ideas. And when I think about them, then I think the way that I write typically or ideally, it's not really one-to-one. It's not, oh, I read this idea, so I'm going to write about it. It's usually I have come across 2 or 3 ideas and I've been able to connect them. And now there is something that I can write about that's actually different from each of those 3, but is connected in a way. And so then I can end up writing something that feels new or that feels interesting. And there's a place that it comes from. It has, some lineage, but I get to write something fresh and something that's exciting and interesting to me.
Interesting. So reading, and so while you're working, also those ideas are synthesized or connected, and so you can think of some like good ideas to write and so connect them, right?
Yeah, exactly. So, and one thing that I would mention as well is a lot of that, I store a lot of ideas in Notion. Maybe I'll start using Glasp for a lot of those things. So far, for a lot of my notes, I would just save them in Notion. And I think, so I was doing a workshop actually recently, and I was teaching some people how I do some of this in Notion. And I think to summarize it, the point is that I very rarely, especially writing 3 different newsletters or, maybe even writing more stuff, it's so, but even before I started doing that, when I was just writing one, I used to find it so difficult. And I think what unlocked that for me is that I stopped trying to write one newsletter, and because that created a lot of pressure for me to try and sit down and write a few thousand words just on one thing. And so now anytime I have an idea, I'll just start making some notes, and none of them will be finished, but every time I come across something else that maybe is interesting or connected, then I can go back and I can add some more. And then when I need to publish something, so the main one is on Thursdays, I can just go back and look through all of my notes and I can see which idea has the most stuff. And then I can just quickly turn that into a finalized idea instead of writing each thing from scratch. And I think doing things that way is really interesting because a great example is right now I'm actually working on a book. And I can tell you more about that if you're interested. But what has been great about that process is I'm probably getting close to halfway through, or like a third of the way through. But that first third was so easy because, well, half of it was easy because I've written so much in the past. And actually, there's a lot of notes and things that I've already published, but there's also a lot of stuff I haven't published. But as I start to think about the things that I want to cover, I can just go and grab some parts from different notes. Oh, there's this idea I wrote about here. There's this thing I remember seeing here. But because I brought it all into one place, then it's very easy for me to be able to navigate and use that to create something new.
I see. But I assume you have, I don't know, hundreds or thousands of ideas in Notion or Notion, I assume. And do you search for the old notes? Because if it's 1,000 and when you're searching, so many ideas hit, and I wonder how would you manage those ideas?
Yeah, that's exactly the reason I use Notion, actually, because Notion search usually is quite good. And so, yeah, I think I checked today, I probably have about 1,400 notes or so, at least like the main ones. And then another thing I do actually is, so I have in Notion, I have two databases. One is notes and one is links. So anytime I find something that's interesting, it could be about anything, I will save it in the links database and I'll save the full text. So I have the whole article saved somewhere there. And then in the other database, I have my own notes, which is a separate thing. But anytime I have an idea, then I can write about it. And then what that means is when I search, I'm seeing both the things I've written about in the past and also things I've just come across. Some of them I haven't actually read. You know, sometimes you come across something, I don't have time to read it right now, but I'll just save it anyway because I scan it and I see that it's good and I'll save it. So then I can just come across that and it saves me. I don't have to go to Google because I kind of have my own library of stuff that I can go and look at. And if I'm interested in a particular idea, I can just search for that and I can say, oh, actually, I have quite a few notes that link to this thing. And maybe there's one or two pages that I visited before that also talk about this thing, and I can kind of start pulling some ideas together.
I see. And I think now, now Notion has Notion AI, and, also people use ChatGPT and Answer Claude and Google Gemini and so on in their writing process, for some people. And do you use any like Notion AI or, other like AI tools in your writing process, or as a brainstorm partner or ideation and so on?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So I've been on a bit of a journey with this. I would say I'm a big champion of AI and, I definitely advocate for it and I use it in lots of other areas. Sometimes I've resisted to use it in my writing or as a writing aid. I wouldn't really use it to write, but, so I don't use Notion AI. I haven't found it to be super useful, at least when I've used it. I've used it in some use cases to do like automatic tagging and things like that, but not necessarily for writing in Notion. Maybe I just need to figure out how best to use it, but I haven't used that. I have used ChatGPT, and where I'll use that typically or in the past is sometimes I have been struggling with an idea and I just have a bunch of different notes on this idea, but they're not very well organized. And so one thing that is really good for is I can just throw lots of things in there from my notes and I just tell it to, structure it in a well structured way, so that I can see actually everything that's there. And that's useful because then that gives me a starting point for me to be able to write something better. So I would say that's one way I've used it in the past. One thing I've actually just started using it for now in the book that I'm writing, and again, I think this is where I say I wrestled with it. For most of the writing process, up until probably just 2 days ago, I hadn't used any AI. I was just writing it myself. Every chapter I was just writing. And then I think once I got past the point where I already had previous notes that I could rely on, and I was having to write new things from scratch, there were some things I had ideas for, but it wasn't super crystallized. And I actually used Claude for that and not ChatGPT. The reason is because Claude, in my experience, the writing quality is a bit better. And what that means is it can write in my voice a little bit better. And so I didn't necessarily use it to write things in my voice. And I usually think the first output of whatever you get from AI is not that great, but it is good as a thought partner. And so instead of me sitting down and spending 2 hours just thinking really hard about this thing I want to write about, I've already got a few paragraphs of like vague notes of this is kind of what I'm thinking about. And I can put that in there and I can say, what do you think the core thesis of this is? And then it can give me like a condensed version of the thing that I'm thinking about. And then we can just go back and forth as I explore my own idea a bit better. So that's mostly the main way that I've used it, just as a thought partner, where in the past I'd have to go and bug my friends and say, hey, do you want to come take a look at this and give me some feedback? And then I'd make some change and I have to go send it to them again. So instead of annoying my friends, I just have something that I can just continually send updates to, and I'll just copy paste the new thing that I've wrote and I say, hey, what do you think of this? Or, what should I change? Things like that.
Yeah, totally makes sense. And yeah, I do that too. And yeah, I love it. Yeah, that way. And also, when you write something and ready to publish something, this is like a common fallback question to writers maybe, but you need to decide at some point, oh yeah, we should publish this. But people love editing all the time and editing, then something, maybe there might be better way to rephrase this or whatever. And what's your editing process? And how do you decide, oh, this is okay to publish, ready to publish?
This is a great question. I wonder if I'm the best person to answer this. I think I'm the best person to answer this for a particular type of person. And the reason I say that is because I wonder if maybe I would have more viral posts if I sat down for longer and spent a lot more time editing stuff and making things longer. But that's not really what I care for. I care about getting the ideas out there. And so very often, there are posts on my site that I just wrote one time. I was sitting on the train, I wrote it on my phone just because I had the idea, and I typed it out in Notion, and I take a screenshot and I post it on Twitter, and some people like it, and then I just copy the whole thing from Twitter and I just put it on my blog and I publish it. And so there's zero editing. So some things are like that. Some other things are a bit more like the process that I shared, where it's kind of built up over time. But again, I'm not really coming back and editing. Like, as soon as I'm just accumulating the ideas and the thoughts, and then I'm cleaning it up, I'm adding some analogies or, stories, things like that. And usually I publish quite quickly. That's typically my approach. Now, what I would say is there's a slight difference between the newsletter and the blog in terms of how I publish. For the newsletter, generally, I really don't care. I mean, I care a lot, but I care enough to just try and write the first draft as good as possible. But then I'm just going to hit publish. I can always just go back and check it and edit it later. And I think maybe that's one way I think differently from some people, where they'll spend a really long time publishing it, polishing it. They'll get loads of other people to check it, etc. There's been only a few times that I've got people to check things before I publish it. And that's usually where maybe there's a personal angle or there's something I'm not sure about how it might come across to other people. So I'll ask some friends to check it. But usually I just hit publish, and I can always go back and edit it later. That's how I think about it. But that editing is usually for typos. I think, yeah, sometimes you just hit and you write a great post and it's fantastic. Sometimes you miss. But the other thing I would say, and this is still on the publishing online part, is that, at least in my experience, I would prioritize being prolific over being perfect. So what you might find is I will write 3 posts about the same thing, not all at the same time, but, let's say in the last year or so, I've had 3 attempts of, oh, this thought has come to my mind, it's really interesting, and I'll just write something about it. And each one is slightly different, and they might be coming from different angles, but the very first time I wrote about something, it may not have been that great, but the second or third time I write about that same thing, I think it will be great. And I think the thing about the internet that most people, I think, take for granted is that people underestimate how much rubbish is online. The internet's full of just millions of rubbish articles. So it's okay. If I publish something and it sucks and no one wants to read it, do you know what? No one's going to read it. No one will actually even know that it exists. So if I write something and it's bad, no one will ever see it. If I write something and it's good, then people will see it. So all I have to do is just keep publishing stuff until I write something good enough that lots of people see it. So that's what I would say with online stuff. With offline stuff, this is a little bit of a secret thing. It might take a bit long to explain. But the way that I run my newsletter now is that for most of the newsletters, they are at least half pre-written. And so it runs in a sequence, and I still write new newsletters every week. But the newsletter, let's say you sign up for my main Thursday newsletter today, the post that you get, like the whole newsletter, half of it will be brand new as of this week. And that's usually like the updates and, oh, here's my latest podcast and here's what's happening here, here's what's happening there. Those things are new, but the main post, I've already written it. And in fact, that main post, I wrote that a few years ago. But because it's now a sequence. So this week, we're recording this on Friday. Yesterday, the people that were subscribed to my newsletter 2 or 3 years ago got a brand new article that I just wrote and published this week. The people that subscribed 1 week after them got the thing that I just wrote last week. And so that's a sequence that goes all the way back. So if you subscribe right now, you're going to get something that I wrote a while ago. And the aim of that, and this will maybe lead to something we can discuss later, but the aim of that is technically I could die tomorrow and you will still get emails from me for at least the next 4 years. There will be some parts that, won't have been updated, but at least the main post I know will always be there. But to go back to your question about the editing, the thing that I think I would say with that is that I'm still not lazy about that. So just because it's that main article is a sequence in that way, that doesn't mean I never go back and update it. In fact, I do that almost every month. Maybe every month or two, I will go back through every single email and I'll update them. So actually, the version of that email that you get if you subscribe now is much better than the version of that email that someone got a year ago. And it might actually be completely different. It's still about the same thing, but I'm going to keep coming back and improving it so that hopefully you get the very best version of that thing.
That's so smart. Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. Yeah. So it's kind of like different, perspective, different point of question. But so what is a like internal driver for writing? So yeah, or like I can say, so when you are writing, so at what moment do you find it the most enjoyable or interesting?
Or excite you the most?
Yeah,
That's a great question. I would probably say, I think it's when I'm having the idea. I think that's the exciting part. Is I'm having this idea. It's either some things that I've just pulled together, or, yeah, I think very very often it happens while I'm walking. I say that quite a lot, but genuinely that probably is when it's happening. Sometimes I might be listening to a podcast when I'm walking, but otherwise I'm just like trying to wrestle with some ideas. I could be on the train, I could be anywhere, but I'm actively working. So I'm not working, but I'm working, and I'm just trying to pull some things together, and I'm trying to think, what does this mean and where does this go? And so that's one version of it. Another version of it is sometimes what I like to do is I listen to a lot of podcasts that are about like history or are about facts and have lots of weird or interesting facts. And then I try and take those things and I think, how could that apply to a regular person's life? And how can I make that something about productivity or, business or technology? Or, like, what does that mean if I put that in a different context? So a really good example that is a very recent example, and I don't think I've actually written about it yet, but I read a book, I think it might have even been last year now, called Flatland. You may not have heard of it. It's not like one of these popular books that loads of people recommend. It was written a very long time ago. But most people read that book and they think it's about physics or about science. And the idea of the book is essentially, it's like a story about a world that is two-dimensional. And the main character is two-dimensional. And so the whole world is like points and lines because you're not seeing the world in 3 dimensions. So different types of people just are different shapes, but all of those shapes are only 2-dimensional. And then one day he has a almost magical experience where suddenly he gets to see the world in 3 dimensions and realizes how different the world is, etc. So that story was told, or at least how people typically think of it, is in terms of like physics. And this is great for being able to understand some physics or some science or things like that. But I read that and I was like, wow, like think about how that applies in a business context. This is a really great way to explain how e-commerce works, for example, as an industry, right? So typically people think about business and they think about offline business. Most people live in flatland, right? You think about your local businesses. What businesses exist around you? You have like your local plumber, you have your local hardware shop. How much money could you make? It depends where you live, because that is the geography that your business exists within. So if there's not really a market for the thing you're trying to build where you are, then it's not viable. You can't make a lot of money. Now, the magic of the internet is that it takes you from this 2-dimensional world into a 3-dimensional space, because now you're not constrained to your local geography. You actually can stack the geographies of lots of different places in the world, anywhere where people are interested in the same thing. And so now that's why you can see online, people can build these businesses. Like you see some people that have e-commerce businesses that make 7, 8, 9 figures, and loads of people can do that. And you think, whoa, surely some of them are lying, but they don't have to be, because you can use the internet to find in 1,000 different places in the world all the people that like this very strange niche thing. If you were constrained, if you were like in the 2D world where you had to be in a particular geography, this business would not work. It wouldn't be viable. But with the internet, suddenly you can actually reach lots of people. And so you're kind of in a 3D space. So again, that's like a random kind of idea where, hey, I read this book that's about something completely different. But in my mind, I can say, hey, actually, I can see how this applies in a different context. Another example is, Funnily enough, I think I've mentioned this on my podcast before, and I still haven't written about it, but I've mentioned it in some keynotes and stuff that I've done. But I read something a while ago about snails, and I don't know how interesting this will be to you, but so
Interesting.
I'm not sure if you know about snails and why snails have like the little snail trails, the little trail of mucus that they leave behind them. So that is actually very metabolically expensive. They use about 60% of their energy just making that little trail behind them. And that's pretty much all they do. And so they make that as they go. And that's actually how they walk or how they move around. They kind of lay that trail and then that they can move on it. But the problem is each snail makes its own trail. And so they're all using so much of their energy making their own trails to move around. But each snail could move about 50% faster if they just followed the other snails. So if one snail went and made a trail and the other snail followed behind it, it could move, 50% faster. But they don't. They all do it their own way, and everyone spends a lot of time and energy just doing it themselves. There are only two types of snails that follow other snails' trails. And I'll ask you this question. Do you have any idea what those two types of snail have in common?
I have no idea. Yeah.
Okay, no pressure. So one is the African land snail and the other is the rose wolf snail, and they are both cannibals. So the only types of snail that have realized I could move so much faster if I just followed other people instead of trying to do everything myself are the ones that are trying to eat them, right? And so you think about that in the context of, okay, like animal life and all of that. But what does that mean for us? And how I think that is useful or applicable is the idea that actually, very similarly, when people build startups or when people are doing creative work, doing writing, it's very easy to think, oh, I should just go off in a cave and just do this by myself and I'm going to do everything from scratch. But everyone could actually go so much faster if we just learn to collaborate a little bit more. And if each person, instead of deciding, oh, I need to build a whole different startup that does the exact same thing, like what if we just collaborated in a way? And, what if I can share some resources with you, you share some resources with me, we all get to move faster as a result. And so, yeah, that's the idea that kind of comes from that. So hopefully that answers your question. But I think those are the things that excite me is when I can make some of those random connections.
Interesting. So basically you are learning and so you want to write for yourself, right? So yeah, because some writers want to like express their ideas and so they like to see so like a reader's life is changing, something like that. Or like some people some writers are very glad when they are praised by audience or something like that. But yeah, I can tell that so you love learning and so like just writing for yourself.
Yeah, I
And
would say
sharing
so.
that excitement
Big-
with others.
Yeah, sharing. So yeah.
Yeah, it sounds quite
Interesting.
selfish, but I do think a big part of it is just writing for
No,
myself and
no,
just
no.
following what I'm interested in.
I mean, so yeah, I think it's the best way to contribute to the world. So in the long run, because like some people are forcing other people to do this, like for like public purpose or public something. But so if they are asking something that they really don't want to do that, so it's a waste of time. So some people need to do it for sure, but so like eventually, so following curiosity or following what they want to do, so we'll find out real like barrier. So in the long run, so no matter if like even if so like the things is not like variable, seems not variable, but in the long term it's gonna be like masterpiece, so it's gonna be like peak, so breakthrough in the future. So yeah, being selfish means like being altruism, so in the future, I think. Yeah, this is my opinion, but yeah.
Yeah, I think so. And it helps you you develop your own ideas a lot further. And the other thing I might mention, this is a bit of a writing tool that I use sometimes. Is I think a lot of people talk about it now, but there's two versions of it. So you might hear some people talk about this idea of copywriting, which is you take some piece of work that someone's already written that is good, and you just write it out word for word. And by doing that, you get a better sense of how they write and what went into that. And you can get a feel for, okay, the rhythm of how they wrote certain things, how they use short sentences, how they use long sentences. And so you kind of get to embody them a little bit as you write out what they wrote. So that's one thing that I think can be good and a lot of people should try. There's another version of that, which is more what I do, which is particularly with nonfiction. With fiction, I do that a lot. So I have loads of books here and I'll just take some books and that helps me to develop my writing. But with nonfiction, I sometimes will look at people like Paul Graham. Paul Graham writes lots of great essays. And I'm very surprised that more people don't do this. I think very often what I see is that Paul Graham will write an essay and lots of people will come online and they'll just like repost his same essay or they might write something. Yeah. But I think what I don't see enough, or what I would love to see more, is more people responding to his ideas and not just writing about what he wrote about, but write what you think about what they wrote about. And so I do that quite a lot where I will listen to someone and I will think, do I agree? And I don't have to agree. And if I disagree, then I will write my own thing. And so very often there are things that I've written and it's actually just because I heard someone say something and I disagree and I'm just going to write my own post. I'm not going to necessarily say, hey, this is me disagreeing with this other person, but I think you can just do that. And so going back to, I'll say two things. Going back to the Paul Graham example, the way that I like to do that is a combination of the copywriting thing and also what I've just said. And I will just go through something that he's written sentence by sentence, and I will try and write it in an even simpler way. But then, so I think that's already useful by itself. It's very hard to do that with Paul Graham because he writes very simply, and that's why it's a bit of a challenge. But the other part of it is then I am kind of being inquisitive about each sentence. So every time he writes something, I look at that sentence and I say, is that true? Is it really true? Because sometimes he will make a claim and he's connecting, he's set up that claim and he's made a claim. Like, what if he's wrong? Or what if I think differently? And I haven't read the rest of the post, and I think that's important. But I just read that thing and I respond to it. And then I keep reading and I see did he deal with my response? Did he deal with this exception that I think I found? And if he hasn't, then I know this is something else I can go write about because he didn't cover that in his piece. And I know that I came to that idea by myself. And so I would just go through it. And it's almost like having a conversation. And they say something, I think, what does that mean for me? And so there's a few other ways I do that. Sometimes I do it when I'm listening to a podcast. So sometimes they will ask the guest a question, and from what they ask, I would just start thinking about how I would answer that. Or if the guest starts speaking, as soon as they mention an idea, I don't wait for them to finish explaining it. I will just pause it and I will just write what I think about that idea. And very often, and this has happened quite a few times, the thing I would think when I hear someone say a phrase is actually different from what they're about to say, but it's now led me to come up with something different, which is cool. And so I get to have my own original idea, even though it kind of links back to an idea that they inspired, but it wasn't actually what they were going to say. And then the blog version of that I also do is I find some people that write similar headings. Like I write my headings a particular way. I would say it's a little bit similar to Seth Godin. I've seen writes his headings the same way. Morgan Housel, I think, writes his headings the same way. They're not like SEO titles. They're just titles that are whatever you want them to be, and they're usually quite short. So that's why I say they're similar. But what that means is you can just look at the title. Just go to, I think Morgan Housel's essays are all on collabfont.co. I think that's the website. Don't click on any of them. Just look at the title and write like whatever that inspires you to write. Just look at the title and write your own post based on that core idea. And usually it will take you in a completely different direction, but then you at least get your own bit of inspiration. And then for fun, you can come back and see, what did they have to say about that idea? And I think that way you can have a bit of dialogue with some other people where it's still collaborative and you still learn from other people. But then at the same time, you still get to have your own original ideas.
I see. I think it's really interesting way to interact with content and also practice your thinking and thought process. And then I think, you do active reading or critical reading and also, guess what they write and also something like that. What would you write, in that with a title or how would you answer that, after a certain point? Yeah, that's very interesting. Yeah, approach. And have you been doing this? I mean, since you were a kid, or did you start doing this practice or you're thinking like at some point, and how did you acquire this skill? And
yeah, that's a great question. I think more of it has come recently, probably in the last few years, especially I think it actually just comes with volume. So the more you write, the more you kind of have to develop your writing. And so I think the more that I've written, like in the last few years, I've written more than I've written probably in the last however many years combined, because I'm not sure how many posts I've written this year, but I think last year or the year before, I probably wrote 200 and something posts. So I would just write lots of stuff. And that's the funny thing, like I was mentioning when I was working on this book. I don't even remember where some of these things are. I just remember I've written something about this before. Then I have to go figure out where did I put that thing? Is it in my Notion? I don't know. Is it in a notebook? Maybe it's there. Is it in a post? Maybe it's there. Is it in a newsletter? So I have to go search in ConvertKit and try and figure out if that's where I wrote about something. But I think just writing that amount of volume does push you a bit in that direction. And then I think especially now when loads of people are trying to write, I would say, I think especially now that my platform is growing, I don't know if it's about the platform, but it's more that I get to interact with a lot of other interesting people whose ideas I admire. And in order to push myself and to push the way that I think about ideas, I have to find new ways of like processing things, because otherwise I think it can be very easy to fall into the trap of just copying. And a lot of people, they don't know they're copying, but they are just, because they're mostly consuming ideas. By the time you've consumed an idea 5 times, you will write about it and think it's a new idea, but actually it's coming from all these different places. So that's why a lot of the things I was mentioning are actually things where I will start consuming, but then I'll stop. And I'll only consume enough that just inspires me to think of something else. And then I have the freedom to go off and think about my own thing. And I will still come back and listen, but then I can make sure that I preserve some of the originality of the thought. And that thought might not be the final thought. It might still later be combined with a few different things. But I think that's just a way to preserve being an original thinker. Maybe you don't have to start there. Maybe for some people, it's better to start just by copying, or not copying exactly, but, emulating someone that you appreciate and looking at what someone's written and trying to write your own version of that thing. I think that's okay. But then the more you write, you want to be able to have your own original ideas and think of things in original ways. One last thing I'll say, I don't want to keep rambling with my responses, but I was thinking about it earlier today, and there's someone I had in mind in particular when I was saying this. I won't mention their name here, but I would just mention the general trap I think people fall into, especially with things like mental models. So, and it applies to mental models, it applies to other types of things. There are a lot of things which are basically just what I would call abstractions. These are tools or things that you can use to navigate the world, or a name that represents a body of thought. So, for example, you might say confirmation bias. That's an abstraction. That's not really like it's a phrase that represents an idea. The problem is most people only navigate the world through abstractions. So they only navigate using the phrase confirmation bias. And they are navigating based on these different phrases instead of navigating with the underlying idea. And I think what you really want to develop and be able to do is to kind of go a layer below the abstraction to the core idea. And then you'll realize that actually a lot of these different things that seem disconnected, maybe they are connected. And then you can rebuild your own abstraction somewhere else, or, in a slightly different way. But that comes from understanding and interacting with the core idea. So every time you come across something that you find interesting, I think it's just developing this sense of asking deeper questions and trying to understand, okay, this person said something. I respect that person. That doesn't mean it's true. Like, what's the underlying truth here? What does that actually mean? Under what conditions would this be true? Under what conditions would it not be true? And so you just try and investigate the idea by itself. And when you get to the core of it, then you have like a core nugget of, like this is the fundamental truth. In this context, this is how it works. But actually, in this context, it would probably work differently. And then that opens up your mind to think about things in different ways.
I see. Yeah, really interesting. And I don't know if this is related to that part, but I remember I read the research paper or blog, someone's blog, that the more you read, the less you share. And the less you read and the more you share, right? Meaning people sharing articles on Twitter or X or somewhere, but those people usually, according to the research, they don't read the full context. But people read the whole content. They don't share because they understand it in themselves. Sorry, that idea came back to me. Yeah, but anyway, yeah.
Yeah, I agree. And also something I mentioned in the course that I teach called Decision Hacker is this idea that there are levels of abstractions. And I think that's another key point. So it's that there's not just one level of abstraction. So for example, you mentioned a study, and I'm not referring to you here, but this is a pattern that I see very often. So the core truth is not the study. The core truth is the data of the research. Now, what happens is, so imagine that's like layer one, is you have data. Writing a research study abstracts that data into a representation that is shareable. But you already lose a bit of the fidelity. You lose some of the nuance of the original data just because sometimes different researchers, they might have a bit of bias. They already have something that they know they want to write. And so they interpret the data in a particular way. So there's one layer of someone's interpretation that you have to go through. The problem is, and that's just the research study layer, most people don't even read the study. You go up one layer from there, and what happens is someone's writing a book and they go and collect lots of different studies and they put them in their book. Or actually, no, in between that, what you will probably have is a research paper, or you have like a scientific publication. And in that publication, what are they doing? They're going and gathering various studies. But those publications can be biased. Sometimes there are studies they want to publish. There are studies they don't want to publish. Those studies still exist. They still got done. They're still the data, but they have their own lens of viewing the world. And so that now becomes the second layer of abstracting the original data. Then someone writes a book and they write this book and they reference the publication, which, is based on the original study, which is based on the data. So that's now like a third layer of abstraction. And then someone reads the book and mentions it on a podcast. And so then what you have is like someone mentioned something on a podcast and that podcaster read it in a book and that book was based on the study. So you're now like 6 or 7 layers separated from the original truth. And if you only deal on that layer, then you can only appreciate how far away you might be from the actual truth, because at some point in that chain, a lot of detail might have been lost. The Dunning-Kruger effect is a really good example of this. The Dunning-Kruger effect doesn't mean what most people think it means, but it's kind of ironic that because it doesn't mean what people think it means, it's actually become the misrepresentation, if that makes sense. Like the definition of it that exists now does represent something that exists, but what it doesn't represent is what is in the original study. It's actually something separate. Like it's no longer describing what was in the study, but it is now good at describing something else. And so that's just the kind of thing that exists in the world. So that's something I would encourage a lot of people to do, is just try and go back. So going to what you were saying, like try and read, if someone says something that you find interesting, go and try and figure out what did they read to think of that thing. I'll give you one more example, and I know I'm rambling a little bit here, but there's a really great phrase that James Clear uses in Atomic Habits, and I'm forgetting what the phrase is, but there's a phrase that he used in that book, and I've heard other people talk about that phrase, or maybe they have their own version of that phrase, and it's very funny realizing now in retrospect that, okay, James Clear got that idea from reading someone else's book, and that person's book came from this old Roman guy. So it's like, oh, there's a lineage of this idea, and most people, the version of it that they connect to, I know where that came from, but I also know that that wasn't the original idea. The original idea is actually slightly different, but along the line, it kind of became this other thing, and that is the thing most people reference, and so they take away this idea. But actually, if you kind of trace back and you think, okay, where does that person get their ideas for? What does that person read? Then maybe it can lead you to thinking about something else that you might not have realized or you might not have thought of if you're only starting at that top layer.
Yeah. And also, another famous quote, stay hungry, stay foolish. People quote Steve Jobs for that quote, but originally came from whole earth stuff, right? Yeah, it's that Steve Jobs just following that word, but people say, oh, it's said by Steve Jobs, and yeah, similar to that, and yeah, I see.
Yeah, exactly. That's a perfect example. I think another one that I think of often is when people talk about like alpha males and this idea of, oh, this person's the alpha. Like, okay, that idea came from a guy that was, I think he was writing about wolves, and it doesn't even mean what people think it means. And it also has nothing to do with humans. Like, that idea has never been applied to human beings ever, so it is not even applicable. But then on top of that, it also doesn't mean what people think it means, even when it is being applied to wolves. So it's just funny how, someone writes a phrase about an idea and it kind of takes on a life and becomes something else, and people don't really appreciate like what that thing originally was. And there's loads of examples like this. I'm trying to think of any that come to mind. The Bechdel test. Have you heard of that? Okay, so sometimes people reference something called the Bechdel test, and they mention it in terms of in filmmaking. So you will see a film, and if there are not, and the Bechdel test is essentially whether or not there are, I think there's like 3 criteria. It's like you have more than one woman, and those 2 women interact with each other, and the interaction that they have is not about another man. So it's like a 3-step test to figure out, okay, is this like a sexist film or something that I'm watching? Okay. But the joke is that the Bechdel test is named after this woman. That was her surname, Bechdel. She was like a cartoonist, and it actually just comes from like this old lesbian comics thing. But she just wrote it as a joke in her little cartoon strip. And now it's something that people talk about. They don't even know whose name they're referencing. Like, people just say, oh, this is the test. But they don't realize like where that came from. It was someone actually just making a joke a really long time ago. And okay, maybe it's useful in a way now, but it's, again, one of these things that people don't realize actually comes from something else.
At the same time, really interesting conversation. And at the same time, you mentioned there are many layers, people's interpretation and if we went through the information we are consuming. And at the same time, as you mentioned, at the same time, sometimes we misunderstand the concept, but at the same time, that is kind of our creativity, right? And some people misunderstand the concept. That's why they came up with something interesting, new ideas, because of their, thanks to their creativity. And there's some pros and cons, and that's interesting. Another topic, I think.
That's a really good point. So sometimes it is, that misconception can lead to you thinking of something new. I would say also sometimes intentionally, kind of like what I was describing before, you can just think about how something might apply differently. I would say I was just thinking now about another class of thing, slightly similar but slightly different, where this type of thing comes up. And you can tell me if you're no longer finding this interesting, because I'm now going off on a slightly different tangent. But there are also a class of things that exist or are true, but only at one point in time. And what is interesting about that is that very often you are born at one point in time and you look at the world and everything there is to understand about the world. And it's very easy to assume that how things are is how they always were. And this is like, 1, there's a reason why things are like this now. And 2, this is the facts. Like, how the world looks to me now is, factual. But for example, you might know that Santa Claus doesn't wear green, except he used to wear green. Like, when we think of Santa Claus wears red. Santa Claus did not always wear red. Santa Claus used to wear green, and that changed over time. Another example that was quite funny that I came across because I was reading an old book, and I think this is where it gave me the idea. So this was an old book. It might have been How to Win Friends and Influence People or something like that, one of those types of books. But in the book, they make a statement of fact that they believe to be true about the world. And they said something like, everyone knows that when people propose, no one gets down on one knee anymore like our parents used to do, because no one does that. And it's funny because that's exactly what people do now. But at that point in time, the thing that was true is that people no longer did that because they actually used to do that, 2 generations ago. And so again, it's one of these funny things that if you were just born at this point in time, you would assume that, this is how people do things, or this is how they always did things. But actually, the thing that was true to someone else that was born at a different point in time is almost the complete opposite. Like, and they're talking about the same thing, right? You're talking about the same Santa Claus. The reason I mentioned the green Santa Claus thing is, again, because I was reading, it was an old Sherlock Holmes book, and Sherlock's just talking and he sees Santa Claus. Santa Claus is wearing green. And I'm thinking, hold on, Santa Claus doesn't wear green. Santa Claus wears red. But again, like, it's only because I live in a different point in time. And I think there's a lot of things that are like that. Sometimes that applies to science, where there are some points in time where there's something we believe to be true based on the current science, and that science is later proven wrong. But if everyone still keeps going to read that same book, then nobody actually realizes that the new science is very different. And so again, it's another one of these interesting things where sometimes our ideas about the world, if we don't go and try to investigate things properly, we can easily be misled very unintentionally just because of the way that the world changes and the way that information changes.
Yeah, really interesting. Yeah, topic and conversation. Yeah. Anyway, yeah. So yeah, you already shared a little bit, but our audience is like aspiring writers and learners and so on. And do you have some advice to them? And this is the second last question, by the way.
So, general advice for like writing, or general advice for learning?
Yeah. Mhm.
Okay. General advice for learning, I would say, very similar to what I said before, is just develop a habit of questioning things. And don't question things, just to be obnoxious, but question things so that you can learn. And I think that's the best way to really learn things. And I think and I think that is also then becomes a habit for writing, just thinking about the things that you don't know, or things you don't know well enough. So for example, a few months ago, I was on a holiday with some family in Florida, and we were going on this little, like a boat ride where they have alligators. And I was just looking down at the water and I just thought, I probably don't know enough about fluid dynamics. And, when you look at, okay, this lily pad that's floating on the water, okay, there's a certain number of things I understand about the difference between why there's enough surface tension that keeps some things above the water, but there are some things that can kind of come up through the water. There are some things that, you can drop into the water and they sink. There's loads of different properties of water, and just being able to look at that, and instead of just thinking, oh, that looks pretty, but being able to think, how much do I really know about how that works? And what things do I know and what things don't I know? And that might prompt me to go and think and go to research and go and figure out, like, what do I not fully understand here? And just developing that kind of internal stillness, I think, is probably a really great tool, both for learning and for writing. Another example I can think of this was sometime last year. Again, I was just going off for a walk, and I was walking, and I think at one point, I just noticed something very slight, and I didn't know what it was, and I kind of took a step back and retraced my steps a little bit. And it looked like there was smoke coming out of some bushes. And my first thought was, maybe did someone have a cigarette and they threw it into the bush? But what I realized just by kind of standing there and studying it was that the sun was out, but it was raining earlier. And what that meant is that behind this row of bushes was a wooden fence. So what was actually happening is that the sun was now shining bright enough that water vapor was evaporating from the fence, and it kind of created like a little artifact in the air. And okay, that sounds like a random, silly thing, but even just from being able to see that, it gave me an idea of something I could write about, which is this idea that there are some things that are only possible to see if you take the slowest possible mode of transport. Because I was actually on my way to the gym, and I could have taken the train, and it would have been 10 minutes and I could have been at my destination. But I decided to walk. The walk is actually a lot longer. It takes 40 minutes. But because I walked, I got to see this thing. And so it gave me this idea that actually, the speed at which you travel through the world changes the way that you see the world. And again, it's just something to think about. So I think if you can develop that kind of inquisitiveness, it allows you to see things that you otherwise might not have seen. So that's an idea for learning, I would say. And for writing, I think that also applies to writing. The other thing I would say with writing is similar to some of the things I've shared before. Don't be hesitant just to share things or put things out into the world. The truth is, if you have an idea of writing a newsletter, for example, 98% of every email sent is spam. Okay. It doesn't even go into people's inboxes. Most emails are spam. That's like a real statistic that most emails are spam. On YouTube, I think it's something like 9% of all. Oh, sorry. It's the opposite. So 91% of everyone on YouTube, they don't even have an account. They are just on YouTube. Like they don't even have a channel. Okay. Let alone making videos. Only 1% of people actually make videos. So the vast majority, if you're worried, oh my gosh, is it too late to start a YouTube channel or whatever? Like most people, they don't even have an account to post videos on. So don't worry about it, right? If you make a video and it's really bad, no one is ever going to see it. It would just be lost forever. If you write a blog post and it's really not good, no one's ever going to see it. So there's nothing to worry about. You might as well just write it. And in fact, you write it and then think about it for a few more months while you go off and do other things, and then have another crack at it. Write it again, and write about a similar thing, and eventually you will write something that is great and that people love and that people will share. So, yeah, those are my thoughts.
Yeah, lovely. And yeah, that's really encouraging. Yeah, to overcome the fear of publishing or something. Yeah, thanks. And as Glasp is a platform where people share what they are reading, learning, and as their digital legacy. And do you have some thoughts? What kind of we want to ask you, what kind of legacy or impact do you want to leave behind for the future generations, if you have any?
Okay. Yeah, this is a great question. And I actually do have one. And it might sound slightly egotistical for me to have one, but I do. And it links to something I told you guys before. Now, I haven't actually said this anywhere publicly before, but I recently mentioned it. I was doing a workshop privately with a group of people, and I mentioned it for the first time. So I will tell you as an exclusive. So I mentioned before that the way that I write my newsletter is that a lot of them, I'm always writing new stuff, but I structure it in a way that at least the main post is sequenced, so that when you start with like a post that I wrote a long time ago, and so that there will always be stuff for you to read. So right now, if you sign up for my newsletter today and I die tomorrow, you will still be getting emails from me for at least the next 4 years. However, I'm not going to stop writing my newsletter today. I'm still going to be writing my newsletter every week for at least, hopefully, another 40 years. So, I don't know if either of you are into sci-fi or have ever read the book Foundation by Isaac Asimov, or the trilogy Foundation. Okay, so you might be familiar with the idea of like a Seldon crises. Okay, so this was actually one of the ideas I had in the back of my mind when I was starting my newsletter. And it took a little while for some of these things to come into fruition. But the idea is, so explaining what Seldon crises are, in the book Foundation, there was a mathematician called Harry Seldon, and he developed a unique type of mathematics. I think it was called psychohistory, where he was able to predict things that would happen very far off into the future. And so what he did was he made all these predictions and kind of set things into motion. So what happened is, years and years after he'd already died, sometimes at people's lives, there would come a point where they were in a particular crisis. And just almost as if by magic, a projection would appear from Harry Seldon that he'd already prepared years before that could actually help them out of a tough situation. And so he'd already taken the time to prepare all this stuff in advance because he'd predicted that one day people are going to need this bit of information. And just at the right time, they get that information and it helps them to navigate something in their lives. And so that's kind of the idea that I had for the knowledge at the same time, which is, and it might sound, a little bit lofty and ambitious, but I just love the idea that, hey, if I can dedicate my life to doing this kind of work, then it would be incredible if 50, 100 years, okay, maybe not 100 years, but years and years after I have gone, that someone could subscribe to my newsletter, as long as someone continues to pay the hosting fees, but someone could subscribe to my newsletter, and like they could actually go their entire lives and they will get my newsletter longer than even they are alive. But not just that, but at different points in their life, they might come into some kind of crisis or some kind of difficult situation that they need to be able to navigate. And at just the right time, they might receive something that I've written a long time ago now that can help them to successfully navigate this kind of situation. So I think that sounds very ambitious, but that's the aim. And I think it's very easily achievable. All I have to do is keep writing. On pretty good track if I write a few posts a week for the next a few decades, then I think it's easily possible that I could pass away and actually, someone could subscribe to my newsletter the next day, and for the rest of their lives, they could be getting emails from me even when I'm not here. And the point is not about them getting emails from me, but the point is, if I can spend enough time thinking about deep things, lasting things, real fundamental truths about the world and how to navigate, then the world and how to navigate it, then there will always be lessons or things that they might find useful from what I've written, because I'm not just writing about the Trump election or, someone's presidency or, things that are about right now, but I'm trying to write about the way that we learn and the way that we interact with each other and things that are hopefully a bit more lasting. So yeah, that's the aim or the ambition.
Yeah, I really love it. Yeah, living evergreen content, or your thoughts and so on. Yeah, over time. And yeah, that's really impressive. And yeah, thank you so much for joining today, and we really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you so much.
No problem at all. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much.